And it's a wonderful passage because it's a passage which is all about resurrection. It's the seventh sign, and you remember we set out at the beginning of September to look at the 7 signs in John's Gospel, signs which point beyond themselves to the significance and the authority of Jesus. And this is the seventh, the last of the 7 signs. And what better morning to talk about resurrection than when we gather around the communion table, which is itself all about resurrection. The bread and the wine speaking so clearly to us about the resurrected Christ. Signs and symbols of resurrection and the resurrected life which Jesus gives to us. Now, this story of the raising of Lazarus from the dead is, of course, a familiar story. It's one we all know well. And it's familiar also because it contains its famous, "I am the resurrection and the life" saying. It's a story which is about a special family, Lazarus and his 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. And this brother and his 2 sisters, who appear to have shared the same house, were very close friends of Jesus. The language which is used throughout John chapter 11 to describe their friendship is language which is close and familiar and intimate. So these were amongst Jesus' closest friends, if not his very closest friends. And at the beginning of the chapter, word is sent to Jesus, who seems to have been far away from Bethany at that point, that Lazarus is not well, that he's extremely ill. In fact, that he's at the point of death. And Jesus, for one reason or another, takes his time about getting there. We're told that in verse 6. But eventually, when he makes it to the home, the funeral is well underway. And when Martha finds out that Jesus is approaching the home in verse 20, she runs out to meet him, while Mary stays at home where she is. Now that's a fascinating little contrast between the 2 sisters, because these 2 sisters appear a couple of times in the Gospel. And that's always the case. Martha is always the doer. Martha's always up and at it. Mary's always more the contemplative. She's the quieter. She always seems to be more stand back, stand and wait, sit and wait, and be more meditative and contemplative in her approach. But Martha, she's up, she's out of the house, she runs to meet Jesus and to berate Jesus for taking so long and coming there. In verse 21, "Lord," Martha says to Jesus, "if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." So you can hear the anguish and the frustration that's in Martha's voice. And Jesus responds to Martha with this very well-known, some of the most famous and most often quoted verse and words in the Bible, words which are quoted at every funeral service I've ever been at. "I am the resurrection and the life, Martha. He who believes in me, even though he dies, he will live, and whosoever lives and believes in me will never die." And following on from this colossal "I am" saying, Jesus moves inside the home where he meets Mary, the other bereaved sister. And Mary falls at his feet and says more or less the same thing to him as her sister Martha has just said a couple of minutes ago. "Master, if you'd been here, my brother wouldn't have died." And in response to Mary's rebuke, Jesus breaks down and weeps in what is recorded to be the shortest verse in the Bible. So this sign of raising Lazarus from the dead teaches us a couple of things, a couple of hugely important things about Jesus. And I want to think about 2 things in particular. 2 amazing things about who he is and the authority that he has. The first thing I want to say is that the weeping of Jesus tells us who he is. The weeping of Jesus shows us who he is. This is a sign that he is the God-man. He's not just God, and he's not just human either. He's not all flesh, and he's not all deity, and he's not something in between the two. He is both and together. As Charles Wesley puts it in his great Christmas carol, veiled in flesh the Godhead see, hail the incarnate deity. And that's exactly what you see here right before your eyes as Jesus stands at the graveside of his friend Lazarus with tears streaming down his face. He is a human Christ who is also divine. He is a divine Christ who is also human. He is all God and he is all man. He is all divine. He is all human, all at one and the same time. The incarnate Christ. Now, we have huge difficulty with this. It's so hard for us to hold these two great truths about the nature of Jesus together as one. We can hardly get our heads around it. That he's 100% God, 100% man at one and the same time. It's such a difficult concept. That he's always both. So that when he weeps like a child at this graveside, it's not that he has somehow or other set his divinity to one side for a minute and he's acting as a human being. Or at other times in the gospel when he performs great miracles like raising the dead, as he'll soon be doing, that he has switched into his divine nature and put off his humanity. He doesn't flit between the two. He's always both and. He's always the God-man. And in this story, we have both his humanity and his divinity together in an amazing way on the one page. And what he does with Mary and Martha startles every one of us. Because first of all, we see him in control. In verse 25, with Martha, with this great resounding statement of resurrection power. I am the resurrection and the life. And then in an instant with Mary, we see him in tears. The tears blinding him as he weeps openly for his friend. He's both God and man, human and divine. And the truth of the matter is that he is divinely in control at the same time as he is humanly weak. He's not someone who's somewhere in between being human and divine. He's not someone who's half the one and half the other. He's both together. And this brings us to the very heart of one of the greatest mysteries of the universe. The very thing that even angels long to look at. And you may protest that you're far too scientific, far too sophisticated to believe in any such nonsense as this. And you may protest that you're not going to believe in something that can't be explained, for it's inexplicable. And you may say, I can't possibly believe in such a thing that God became man. This incarnational theology. I can't believe that. But then you see there are so many things that you believe in that you can't explain. Lots of them, every day. You believe in the energy of the sun that's coming in the window and touching the back of your hand, but you can't explain energy. No more than the greatest astrophysicist in the universe can. And you'll go home and pour yourself a glass of water this afternoon and have a drink. You can't explain hydrogen bonding and how water works. But you believe it. There's ice, and there's liquid, and there's steam, and You take it for granted. So whether or not you can explain the incarnation, the God-man theology of Jesus, isn't the issue at all. The issue is that this man, Jesus, is the very person you need in your life right now. He's the one that you need at the moment of your greatest weakness, at the moment of your greatest trouble. And more than that, he's the one that you need to deal with your sin. For he's the only one who has died on the cross for sin, the only one who shed his blood, the only one who has been broken, the only one who offers forgiveness of sin. And that is our greatest need. And if he was only God, he couldn't do that. And if he was only human, he couldn't do it either. But he's both. And you need both. And I need both. And as we come to this table this morning, he comes to us in the bread and in the wine as both together. God and man. And there's a cavern in your heart and in my heart that's shaped like him, and it won't be filled by anyone else or anything else in this world, no matter how hard you try. For only Jesus has died on the cross, and he is the one you seek, and his forgiveness is what you need. No one else has shed his blood for you. No one else has been beaten and bruised for you, and no one else can forgive sins, and no one else can bring healing but him. His tears show us who he is. He is the incarnate God. He is Emmanuel, God with us. And as we take the bread and the wine in our hands, he comes to us in all his divine human glory. And he touches our lives with his truth, with his forgiveness, and with his healing. For he is the wonderful Counselor, the mighty God, the everlasting Father. And right now, he's standing here at this communion table in front of your very eyes. But there's more to this story than tears, because also in verse 33 and verse 38, we see something of Jesus which maybe we're not so sure we'd like to see. We see his anger. Indeed, we see his rage. And I want to suggest that the rage of Jesus tells us about what he came to do. In verse 33, we read that when Jesus saw her, that was Mary, weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And it's this word troubled. Down in verse 38, we have it again. Jesus, once more deeply moved, deeply troubled, came to the tomb. And this word is a Greek word which has been a real quandary for translators for generations and years. The scholars who wrote the NIV translation, which we use in our pews, and which, by the way, I believe is one of the best and the most accurate translations around, they didn't solve this quandary either. In verse 33, they use this word deeply moved, deeply troubled in spirit. In verse 38, once more deeply moved. But here's the quandary. The only other place in the New Testament that this word is used is in Mark 14 and verse 5. When Mary, the very same Mary, whose brother is now dead, when Mary takes the enormously expensive bottle of perfume, you remember that story, and she breaks it over the feet of Jesus, and she anoints his feet with this expensive perfume, and we're told that everyone in the gathering comes at her for her wanton wastefulness. And the NIV says that everyone rebuked her harshly. It's the same word. In other words, they yelled at her. In other words, they were not polite to Mary. And everywhere else in common parlance where this word is used, it's translated to snort or to bellow with anger. In fact, it's usually used to describe a noise made by an animal. So you see the problem that translators have? It's talking about a kind of primordial animal rage. And the translators don't know what to do with it because they're far too polite and far too respectful to attribute such a rage to Jesus. You see the quandary? Who would want to attribute such a word to the God-man? No one would want to say that he snorted with rage like an animal or yelled with anger and frustration. But Eugene Peterson, in his translation, The Message, I think he gets it right. In verse 33, he translates it, when Jesus saw her weeping, he became intensely angry. And in verse 38, Peterson translates, quaking with rage. Jesus approached the tomb where Lazarus was. In other words, there was a towering anger in Jesus' grief. Jesus didn't approach the tomb of Lazarus sniveling with weakness. Not at all. He approached the tomb of Lazarus as a champion approaches the foe. So we're bound to ask, why was he so angry? What made him angry? Why would Jesus, so filled with grief, be so quaking with rage at the same time? Especially since he knows that in a few minutes' time, he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. He's going to bring him out of the tomb alive. So why this anger? Well, look at verse 33. When Jesus saw her, that was Mary, weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit. He was angry. The level of the anguish and the level of the anger which Jesus shows can't just be accounted for in his love and concern for Mary and Martha alone. He's thinking of more than just the family. There's a lot more going on than personal grief. So here's what I think. Here's where I believe his God-man comes into play. Because Jesus is God, he sees the havoc of death from the inside. Do you know what I mean? He sees the havoc and the destructive forces of death from a completely different perspective than we do. And he feels it keenly. And he sees its devastating effect all around him. And although he's able to interrupt this funeral and turn the whole mourning procession into a procession of joy and celebration, he's also able to see all of history through it. That's the point. He's looking at all of history through this funeral, and he sees all the funerals that we have here in West Church and far beyond. He's not just looking at Mary and Martha and this assembly of Jews. He sees you and me weeping at countless gravesides. He's weeping for us. And he's angry, full of rage. For this is never how it was intended to be. You see? This was not the plan. Far from it. He's angry at what sin has done to us and its consequences in our lives of destruction and suffering and death. And he weeps with anger. But, and here's the good news, fortunately for us, Jesus doesn't just see us and weep for us. He does far more than that. You and I don't need a God who merely weeps at our pain and our sorrows as we stand at the gravesides of family and friends. I don't need a God who's just full of sympathy. I need a God who's more than mad at death. I need a God who does battle with death and who defeats the foe in his own body and can proclaim, I am the resurrection and the life. That's the kind of God you and I need. A God who not only wipes away our tears in the face of death, but a God who conquers death, defeats death, overcomes death forever. A God who has defeated the powers of darkness once and for all, so that it no longer has victory over us. That's the kind of God we need. And Jesus knew. Jesus knew as plainly as there's a nose on his face that by raising his friend Lazarus from the dead, he's signing his very own death warrant. Look at the consequences of this event. Verses we didn't read. Verses 45 and 46 and 47. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. And verse 53, from that day on, what did they do? They planned to take his life. The consequence of what he's about to do. And Jesus knew without a shadow of a doubt that if he brought Lazarus out of the tomb, it would be at the cost of going into his own tomb. He knew that the only way to raise Lazarus up was to bury himself. And the only way to interrupt this funeral service was to cause his own. And from that day on, they plotted to take his life. The reason why Jesus is quaking with fear and full of anger is because he knows that the only way he's going to interrupt your funeral and mine is to cause his own. The only way to bring us life is to die himself. And as he stands in front of Lazarus' tomb that day, death says to him, you touch him, and I'll touch you. You dare bring Lazarus out, and I'll bury you. And Jesus takes on the enormity of that challenge. And he goes to the cross. And he's buried so that we may have life. And he walks right into the very jaws of death, knowing that they were eventually going to close in on him and hold him in its grip and take his life from him, so that today you and I can come to this table. We can take this bread and this wine. We can proclaim that he is alive, that he is who he said he is, the resurrection and the life. And he's here today to do the only thing that he ever wants to do for us, to fill us with his resurrection grace and power and strength. This table, this bread, this wine are his demonstration to you of his compassion and his love and his forgiveness. So take this bread, take this wine in your hands, and see the true God, the one who is both God and man, the one who has conquered death and today proclaims his resurrection power and victory. Let us pray together. Lord Jesus Christ, we come to you and our hearts are touched by the immensity of your love. We are bowled over with your grace and your courage. And we thank you that you have conquered death, that you are risen again, and that you proclaim over us your glorious words. I am the resurrection